In 1984, the residents of Oakhaven woke to find Hazel Sterling's cabin completely empty. Her husband had died horribly, just weeks prior. The police assumed the grieving 21-year-old wanderer had simply walked into the freezing river. They were wrong. She hadn't left. She was watching them from the water. The logging town of Oakhaven, Oregon, was a place where secrets were buried under layers of pine needles and industrial sawdust. It was a town owned entirely by one bloodline, the Sterlings. Silas Sterling ran the mills, the local bank, and, for all intents and purposes, the police department. When 21-year-old Hazel married Silas's estranged youngest son, Thomas, the town whispered that the poor girl had just signed her own death warrant. Thomas was the anomaly in the Sterling family, soft-spoken, fiercely independent, and disgusted by his father's ruthless, often violent business practices. He and Hazel lived on the extreme edge of Oakhaven, on a rugged 20-acre plot bordering the treacherous Oakhaven River. Their property was famous for one geological feature: Vale Falls, a deafening 70-foot curtain of glacial water that crashed into a rocky basin just a few hundred yards from their front porch. For 2 years, they were happy. Then came the afternoon of November 12th, 1983. Sheriff Boyd Mitchell knocked on Hazel's door, his hat clutched in his hands, though his eyes lacked any genuine sympathy. He delivered the news with practiced sterility. Thomas had been killed in an industrial accident at the remote North Ridge logging site. A massive Douglas fir had supposedly slipped its chains, crushing him instantly. Hazel knew immediately that it was a lie. Thomas hadn't worked a logging site in over a year. He had been employed as an independent mechanic in the neighboring county, specifically to avoid his father's operations. But when she arrived at the county morgue to identify the body, Silas Sterling was already there. Silas didn't offer his daughter-in-law a hug. He simply stepped into her personal space, smelling of expensive cigars and cheap bourbon, and whispered a terrifying directive into her ear. "He took something from me, Hazel. You have until the end of the week to find the lockbox and bring it to my estate. If you don't, you'll be joining him." The funeral was a hollow, agonizing affair. Hazel stood in the pouring rain, watching the town perform their faux grief. She felt a profound, suffocating isolation. She had no family of her own. She was a foster child who had drifted into Oakhaven at 18, waiting tables until Thomas offered her a life of safety and love. Now she was utterly alone, trapped in a town where the patriarch wanted her dead, and the law would gladly dig the grave. Returning to her empty, freezing cabin, Hazel tore the place apart. She spent 3 days ripping up floorboards, checking the attic, and dismantling Thomas's workshop. On the third night, driven by a manic desperation, she noticed a subtle irregularity in the stone hearth of their fireplace. With a heavy iron crowbar, she pried a loose river stone away, revealing a hollow cavity in the masonry. Inside was a heavy, fire-proof lockbox. Her hands shook as she used Thomas's spare keyring to open it. Inside sat neatly stacked bundles of $100 bills, an astonishing $450,000 in cash. But the money wasn't the most dangerous thing in the box. Beneath the cash lay 2 leather-bound ledgers. Hazel spent the night reading through them, her blood running colder with every turned page. Thomas had meticulously documented his father's empire of extortion, illegal land grabs, and the bribes paid out to state senators, judges, and Sheriff Mitchell. Thomas had stolen the cash, Silas's slush fund, to fund their escape from Oregon, and he had compiled the ledgers to burn his father's empire to the ground on his way out. Silas hadn't just murdered his son. He had executed a threat, and now Hazel was holding the explosive evidence. Panic set in. She couldn't just pack a bag and drive out of town. The only road out of Oakhaven was a narrow, winding mountain pass, strictly monitored by the local deputies. If she tried to board a bus, the ticket agent, Silas's brother-in-law, would make a phone call. If she went to the state police, she risked walking into the hands of an officer on Silas's payroll. She was cornered. Adding to her terror, a wave of morning sickness hit her the next day. A frantic trip to her medicine cabinet and a few hurried calculations confirmed her deepest fear. She was 8 weeks pregnant. Hazel sat on her porch, staring blindly at the thundering cascade of Vale Falls. The roar of the water usually brought her peace, a white noise that drowned out the world. Thomas used to tell her about the geology of the falls. He told her that the waterfall was actually a shelf, and behind the curtain of water was a deep, natural limestone recess carved out by centuries of erosion. He had joked about turning it into a secret fishing spot. As she watched the mist rise from the freezing water, a wild, desperate, and utterly insane idea began to take root in her mind. She couldn't leave Oakhaven. But what if she simply ceased to exist? What if she vanished into the very landscape that Silas thought he owned? She didn't just need to hide. She needed a fortress. Building a habitable room behind a 70-foot waterfall, while under the watchful eye of a corrupt town, was an impossible task for one person. Hazel needed an accomplice, someone who possessed the necessary skills, knew how to keep their mouth shut, and most importantly, harbored a hatred for Silas Sterling that rivaled her own. There was only one man in Oakhaven who fit the description: Gideon Rowe. Gideon was a disgraced, 60-year-old stonemason and contractor. A decade prior, he had owned the most successful construction firm in the county until Silas Sterling decided he wanted Gideon's prime real estate. Through a series of vicious, manufactured lawsuits and localized bank embargoes, Silas had bankrupted Gideon. The final blow came when Gideon's daughter, unable to cope with the family's sudden, devastating poverty and public humiliation, had taken her own life. Since then, Gideon had become a ghost in Oakhaven, living in a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of town, surviving on cheap whiskey and odd jobs. Hazel approached him under the cover of a severe November thunderstorm. She slipped through the woods, avoiding the main roads, and knocked on his metal door. When Gideon opened it, his eyes bloodshot and suspicious, Hazel didn't hesitate. She stepped inside, dropped a stack of $20,000 in crisp bills onto his rickety table, and laid out her plan. Gideon stared at the young widow, then at the money. "You're asking me to build a tomb, girl," he rasped, his voice rough like sandpaper. "You go back behind that water. The damp and the cold will kill you before Silas's goons ever do." "Not if you build it right, Gideon," Hazel replied, her voice remarkably steady. "Thomas said the recess goes back nearly 15 feet. It has a natural rock ceiling. I need a room, waterproofed, insulated, hidden. You have the skills to build a watertight vault. I have the money to pay you. And more importantly," she paused, locking eyes with the broken man, "I have the ledgers that will eventually put Silas Sterling in a concrete cell for the rest of his miserable life. I just need to survive long enough to figure out how to use them." The mention of Silas's downfall ignited a spark in Gideon's eyes that hadn't been there in 10 years. He agreed. Thus began a grueling, highly clandestine construction project. The logistics were terrifying. They had exactly 3 weeks before Silas's patience ran out. He had already sent Sheriff Mitchell to the cabin twice to check on the grieving widow, a thinly veiled threat of the violence to come. Gideon worked exclusively between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. He parked his rusted truck a mile downriver and carried the materials: bags of quick-drying hydraulic cement, rolls of heavy-duty marine-grade fiberglass insulation, thick PVC piping and sheets of corrugated steel on his back, trudging through the freezing mud. The natural recess behind Vale Falls was dangerously slippery and permanently shrouded in a fine, freezing mist. The noise of the waterfall, however, was their greatest ally. It provided a deafening acoustic shield. Gideon could use power drills and sledgehammers, and the roaring water completely swallowed the sound. Even if someone were standing on Hazel's porch, they wouldn't hear a thing. To secure the perimeter, Gideon built a thick, load-bearing retaining wall, using the hydraulic cement and natural river rocks, seamlessly blending the man-made wall into the cavern's natural stone. He left a heavy, custom-welded marine door, salvaged from an old shipwreck yard on the coast, as the only entry point. The door was painted and textured to look exactly like the wet, mossy bedrock behind the waterfall. Unless someone actually stepped through the punishing curtain of water and pressed their hands against the rock face, the door was entirely invisible. Inside, the space was small, roughly 10 feet by 8 feet, but functional. Gideon layered the walls with a heavy waterproof membrane, followed by thick fiberglass insulation, and finally, cedar planking he had salvaged. The wood gave the bunker a faint, comforting scent, combating the smell of damp earth. The biggest challenges were air, heat, and power. For ventilation, Gideon core-drilled a 4-inch hole upward at a harsh angle, breaking through the bedrock behind the falls and surfacing in a dense thicket of blackberry bushes up on the ridge. He installed a disguised PVC pipe fitted with a battery-operated intake fan. For power, they utilized Thomas's unfinished passion project. Thomas had been secretly constructing a micro-hydroelectric turbine in the river below the falls to pull their cabin off the local power grid. Gideon finished the installation, running heavy, waterproofed cables up the rock face and directly into the hidden bunker. It wasn't enough power to run heavy appliances, but it was enough to keep a small electric space heater running, power a few low-wattage bulbs, and keep a small hot plate operational. As the days ticked by, the physical toll on Hazel was immense. She spent her days pretending to be a paralyzed, grieving widow, allowing townspeople to see her crying on the porch, establishing her despair. By night, she hauled canned goods, dried rice, medical supplies, blankets, and books into the damp, dark cave, preparing for a long, subterranean isolation. On December 5th, Silas Sterling finally lost his patience. Hazel received a phone call. It was Silas. His voice was no longer a quiet threat. It was a promise. "I'm sending Boyd up there tomorrow morning, Hazel. He's going to help you pack your things. You're leaving Oakhaven. But before you go, you're going to give him what belongs to me. If you don't have it, Boyd has instructions to ensure you have a tragic accident by the river. You understand?" "I understand," Hazel whispered, hanging up the phone. The trap was springing. That night, a brutal winter storm rolled into Oakhaven, bringing driving sleet and plunging temperatures. It was the perfect cover. Hazel moved through the cabin like a ghost. She packed the lockbox, the ledgers, and a few last sentimental items. Thomas's watch, their wedding photo. She then staged the scene meticulously. She left a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the kitchen table beside an open, handwritten note. The note was simple, a masterpiece of fabricated despair. "I can't live in this world without him. The river took him, and now it can take me." She walked down to the rocky edge of the Oakhaven River, the freezing sleet biting at her face. She took off her heavy winter boots and placed them neatly side by side on the muddy bank, a universal sign of a water jumper. Barefoot and shivering violently, she walked back up the trail toward Vale Falls. The roar of the water was terrifying in the pitch black. She slipped into a thick, waterproof fisherman's slicker, took a deep breath, and stepped directly into the punishing, freezing cascade of the waterfall. The water hit her like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs, but she pushed through the curtain. She found the marine door, spun the heavy iron latch, and stepped into the absolute darkness of the secret room. She pulled the door shut behind her, sealing it tight. She flipped a switch. A warm, dim yellow light bathed the small cedar room. The electric heater hummed softly in the corner. She was safe. 4 hours later, as the dawn broke over Oakhaven, 2 police cruisers tore up the dirt road to the cabin. Hazel sat on her cot, her hand resting over her stomach, listening. Even through the thick stone and the roar of the falls, she could feel the faint vibrations of their heavy boots stomping across the ground outside. They were hunting a ghost, completely unaware that the prey was sitting mere yards away, buried alive, holding the fuse that would eventually blow their entire world apart. The morning after Hazel's disappearance, the town of Oakhaven erupted into a highly orchestrated frenzy. Through the thick, condensation-slicked walls of her subterranean bunker, Hazel could feel the deep, rhythmic thudding of heavy boots vibrating through the bedrock. She sat rigidly on her small cot, clutching a heavy iron wrench, scarcely daring to breathe. Sheriff Boyd Mitchell and a half-dozen of Silas Sterling's most loyal enforcers scoured the riverbank. They found the carefully staged boots. They found the fabricated suicide note. They brought in tracking dogs, who predictably lost Hazel's scent exactly where the freezing, churning water washed the mud clean. For 3 agonizing days, they dragged the Oakhaven River with heavy iron hooks, their search boats passing mere yards from the thundering curtain of Vale Falls. They were looking for a corpse, entirely blind to the terrified pregnant woman sitting a stone's throw away in a 10 by 8 foot cedar-lined vault. When the river yielded nothing, Silas's rage boiled over. He didn't care about Hazel's life, he cared about the lockbox. Assuming she had hidden it before throwing herself into the water, Silas ordered his men to tear the cabin apart. From her hidden ventilation shaft, expertly camouflaged within a dense thicket of blackberry bushes up on the ridge, Hazel smelled the acrid smoke before she saw the orange glow. Silas had ordered the cabin burned to the foundation. As the flames consumed the only home she had ever truly loved, Hazel wept in the darkness, the deafening white noise of the waterfall swallowing her sobs. She was officially a ghost. Life inside the hidden room became a masterclass in psychological endurance. The physical environment was brutal. Despite Gideon Rowe's masterful waterproofing, the cave was perpetually damp. The humidity clung to everything, her clothes, her books, her skin. The temperature hovered in the low 50s, forcing her to constantly wear layers of wool and run the small electric space heater, which put a massive strain on the micro-hydroelectric turbine Thomas had built in the river below. The most oppressive element, however, was the sound. The relentless, thundering crash of millions of gallons of water hitting the rocky basin 70 feet below never stopped. It was a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. In the first few weeks, the sensory deprivation and the auditory assault induced severe vertigo and paranoia. Hazel combated the madness with military-like discipline. She established a rigid daily routine. She exercised, doing push-ups and squats until her muscles burned, desperately trying to keep her body strong for the child growing inside her. She spent hours meticulously studying Thomas's ledgers by the dim light of a 40-watt bulb, memorizing the names, dates, offshore account numbers, and bribery payouts. She turned Silas Sterling's criminal empire into a mental map, knowing that if the physical books were ever destroyed, she would be the living ledger. Her only lifeline to the outside world was Gideon. He was her guardian angel, operating under the constant threat of lethal retribution. Once every 2 weeks, under the pitch-black cover of a new moon, Gideon would make the treacherous trek down the riverbank, pretending to set night lines for catfish. He established a dead drop, a hollowed-out, rotting cedar stump 50 yards downstream from the falls. Here, he would leave heavy-duty waterproof bags containing essential survival gear, prenatal vitamins, powdered milk, dried beans, batteries, and old newspapers so Hazel could track the passing of time and Silas's movements. In return, Hazel would leave cash from the lockbox to fund his quiet, cautious purchases in neighboring counties, ensuring no local Oakhaven merchants grew suspicious of Gideon's sudden need for feminine hygiene products or baby supplies. Winter gave way to a wet, agonizing spring, and Hazel's body began to change dramatically. The reality of her situation settled heavily upon her shoulders. She was going to give birth in a damp, isolated cave, without a doctor, without painkillers, and without a hospital. The anxiety was a living thing that shared her cot at night. Gideon, recognizing her mounting terror through the brief, frantic notes she left in the dead drop, managed to smuggle in a comprehensive field medic's manual and a sterilized kit of surgical scissors, clean linens, and heavy-duty antibiotics. August of 1984 arrived with a suffocating, humid heat that even the glacial water of the falls couldn't entirely break. On the evening of August 14th, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. A massive summer squall rolled over the Oregon Cascades, bringing torrential rain that swelled the Oakhaven River, turning Vale Falls from a steady curtain into a raging, terrifying torrent. It was during the peak of this storm that Hazel's water broke. Panic, primal and absolute, seized her. She was entirely alone. The river was too high and too violent. There was no way Gideon could reach the dead drop, let alone the hidden door behind the falls, without being swept away and drowned. She had to do this herself. For 14 agonizing hours, Hazel endured a labor that tested the very limits of human pain and endurance. She lay on the small cot, biting down on a thick leather belt to keep from screaming, though even if she had shrieked at the top of her lungs, the roaring waterfall and the thunderous storm outside would have drowned out the sound. She followed the instructions in the field manual with a delirious, desperate focus. She boiled water on the small electric hot plate, sterilized the instruments, and pushed until the blood vessels in her eyes ruptured. Just before dawn, as the storm outside finally began to break, the bunker was filled with a sound sweeter and more powerful than the thundering water outside, the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn. Hazel collapsed back onto the sweat-soaked mattress, pulling the tiny, squalling infant to her chest. She wrapped him in a thermal blanket, her trembling hands clumsily tying off the umbilical cord. Tears of exhaustion and profound, defiant joy streamed down her face. Against impossible odds, against the wrath of nature and the cruelty of Silas Sterling, she had brought life into the darkest corner of Oakhaven. She named him Harrison. Time in the bunker did not pass in days or weeks. It passed in milestones of survival. By the autumn of 1987, Hazel had been a ghost for nearly 4 years. Harrison was now a vibrant, curious 3-year-old boy whose entire universe consisted of an 80-square-foot cedar room and the terrifying, beautiful curtain of water that guarded their door. Raising a toddler in a secret subterranean vault required immense creativity and heartbreaking sacrifices. Harrison had never felt the warmth of direct sunlight on his skin, nor had he ever seen a blade of grass. His skin was pale, and his eyes were highly sensitive to light. To combat his vitamin D deficiency, Hazel fed him a strict diet of fortified powdered milk and crushed vitamins Gideon smuggled in. To ensure his cognitive development, she covered the cedar walls with intricate chalk drawings of animals, trees, and the town of Oakhaven, teaching him to read using the very newspapers that detailed Silas Sterling's ongoing corrupt business expansions. Harrison was a remarkably quiet child. From the moment he could understand words, Hazel taught him the absolute necessity of silence. They communicated in hushed whispers, a habit born of paranoia, even though the waterfall masked all sound. She rigged a small, complex system of polished metal mirrors in the ventilation shaft, angled perfectly to catch a single, brilliant beam of afternoon sunlight and reflect it down into the bunker for 20 minutes a day. Harrison would sit in that tiny, golden square of light, mesmerized, while Hazel watched him with a breaking heart. She knew she could not keep him in the dark forever. Survival was no longer enough. Harrison deserved the world. It was time to burn Silas Sterling's empire to the ground. Over the years, Hazel had painstakingly organized the evidence. Thomas's ledgers were devastating, detailing a decade of federal crimes, racketeering, wire fraud, extortion, and interstate bribery. But Hazel knew that sending the ledgers to the local or state police would be a death sentence. Silas owned them. She needed a weapon that Silas couldn't buy. Through the newspapers Gideon provided, Hazel had been tracking the career of a young, aggressively ambitious FBI agent based out of the Portland field office named Sullivan Reed. Reed had recently made headlines for dismantling a sophisticated logging syndicate in northern Washington. He was an outsider, a man with a reputation for being entirely incorruptible and deeply despised by the entrenched Oregon political machine. He was the perfect executioner. In November of 1987, Hazel initiated her masterstroke. She didn't send the entire ledger at once. That was too risky. Instead, she had Gideon travel 3 counties over to a public library in Eugene. Using a public copier, Gideon duplicated 20 highly specific, damning pages detailing Silas's offshore accounts and a series of massive bribes paid to a state judge. Gideon mailed the package anonymously to Agent Sullivan Reed's direct desk in Portland. Inside was a single, typewritten note. "The Oakhaven ghost has the receipts. Freeze the accounts on page 4. Watch him panic. Wait for my next delivery." When Agent Reed received the package, he initially suspected a crank, but a cursory check of the routing numbers provided in the documents yielded terrifyingly accurate results. Reed quietly secured a federal warrant and froze 3 of Silas Sterling's primary shadow accounts in the Cayman Islands. Over $12 million in liquid assets vanished overnight. The reaction in Oakhaven was instantaneous and explosive. Silas, completely blindsided, descended into a state of paranoid mania. He believed there was a mole in his inner circle. He turned his enforcers against each other. Sheriff Boyd Mitchell was publicly beaten by Silas's men in the town square under suspicion of wearing a wire. The tight-knit, corrupt syndicate began to fracture under the sudden, immense pressure. A month later, Hazel struck again. She sent Gideon to mail a second package, this one containing audio surveillance transcripts Thomas had made of Silas ordering the arson of a competitor's mill, resulting in 2 deaths. Agent Reed used this evidence to secure wiretaps on every phone line entering Silas's heavily guarded estate. By the spring of 1988, Agent Reed had assembled a watertight RICO case against Silas Sterling and 22 of his associates, including the local sheriff and a sitting state senator. But Reed still needed the original ledgers to ensure a conviction that would put Silas away for multiple lifetimes. Hazel knew the end game was approaching. She wrote one final letter to Agent Reed, directing him to bring a heavily armed federal task force to the Oakhaven town square on the morning of May 12th. "I will hand you the original books," she wrote, "but you must ensure Silas is in cuffs before I step into the light." May 12th dawned crisp and clear, At exactly 9 a.m., a convoy of unmarked black SUVs tore into the sleepy, corrupt town of Oakhaven. Dozens of FBI agents wearing tactical gear swarmed the bank, the mill offices, and the sheriff's department. Agent Sullivan Reed personally kicked in the mahogany doors of Silas Sterling's estate, arresting the furious, spitting patriarch in his own dining room. Silas was dragged out into the town square in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing federal lights and a crowd of stunned, whispering townsfolk. As Silas stood there, screaming threats at the federal agents, a heavy silence suddenly fell over the perimeter of the crowd. Emerging from the dense tree line leading down to the Oakhaven River, a figure appeared. She was terribly thin, her skin pale as porcelain, wearing a moth-eaten wool coat. In one arm she clutched a heavy, fireproof lockbox. With her other hand, she held the fingers of a small, blinking 3-year-old boy who was staring up at the vast blue sky in absolute, unbridled wonder. It was Hazel Sterling, the widow who had drowned, the ghost of Oakhaven. The crowd parted as if she were made of fire. Silas Sterling's face drained of all color. His jaw slacked, the arrogant fury melting into a look of profound, superstitious terror. He looked from Hazel to the lockbox, and finally to the boy whose features were a perfect, undeniable mirror of the son Silas had murdered. In that singular moment, Silas realized he had not just been outsmarted, he had been utterly destroyed by the very woman he thought he had buried. Hazel walked directly up to Agent Sullivan Reed. She did not look at Silas. She didn't need to. She placed the heavy lockbox on the hood of an FBI cruiser and popped the latch. "My name is Hazel Sterling," she said, her voice raspy from years of whispering, but ringing with an unbreakable, diamond-hard authority. "These are the original ledgers of the Sterling Syndicate. I believe you've been looking for them." Agent Reed looked at the impossibly pale woman and the squinting child beside her, slowly realizing the sheer magnitude of the hell she must have endured to stand before him today. He nodded, securing the box. "We have, Mrs. Sterling. You're safe now." Hazel looked down at Harrison, who was reaching a tiny hand up to catch a floating dandelion seed, marveling at the first piece of the real world he could touch. She squeezed his hand, the deafening roar of Vale Falls finally fading into the background of her memory. Silas Sterling died in a federal penitentiary in 1998, his corrupt empire entirely dismantled. Gideon Rowe spent his final years as a revered grandfather figure, his reputation fully restored. Hazel and Harrison left the shadows of Oakhaven forever, relocating to a sunlit farmhouse in coastal California. The waterfall still roars over the hidden cavern, keeping the ultimate secret of a young widow who simply refused to ever become a victim.